One of the most important things you can do as a video editor is learn about the footage you're working with. Not all video formats are created equally, and the type of video files you're working with will really determine how far you can push the footage during the editing process. So today I'm gonna try and break down how to understand your video files so that when you sit down to edit, you know exactly what you can expect from the footage you're working with. But first, I wanna give a huge shout out to the sponsor of this video, Puget Systems. More on them later. Let's start out with the two video formats that are most widely used in filmmaking, RAW and LOG. I want to start here because even if you don't shoot RAW or LOG, understanding the difference between the two is kind of the perfect springboard into understanding video in general. Plus, a lot of people think that RAW and LOG are the same thing, or at least very similar, but they're actually very different, so I figured clearing that up right away would be a good idea. First, let's look at RAW video, which technically isn't even video. I know, mind blown, right? RAW video is actually just raw sensor data sent from the camera to a recording device. In order to turn that into video, it needs to go through a process called debayering, which takes all of that sensor data and interprets it into a video format. Now, technically, all cameras do this. They capture raw data, process it, and then turn it into video. The difference is, with cameras that don't support raw recording, all of that processing gets done in the camera, so your white balance, ISO, contrast, sharpening, and even noise reduction are all baked into the image that is recorded on the memory card. With RAW video, it's just the unprocessed data that's put on the memory card, and all of the processing gets done in your NLE. Now, there's good news and bad news about this. The bad news is that not all NLEs support RAW video. For example, if you use Filmora, you won't be able to do anything with RAW. And even if your NLE does support RAW video, there's no guarantee that it'll support RAW video from the camera your footage was shot on. For example, Premiere Pro doesn't support Blackmagic RAW natively. To edit B-RAW in Premiere, you need to purchase a plugin from Blackmagic Design. The good news is that RAW video captures all of the sensor data, so you're getting a lot of flexibility in post when it comes to white balance, color correction, color grading. You get the idea. Okay, let's take a look at a clip so that we can better understand how this works. I'm in DaVinci Resolve and I have a clip of 12-bit 6K Blackmagic RAW lined up and ready to go. Now, remember how I said that RAW is just sensor data and that it has to go through debayering to become something that resembles an actual video? Well, most of that is already done, hence why we can actually see a video here. But the cool thing about RAW is that all of the basic metadata that's baked into normal video is completely adjustable with RAW footage. For example, in the color page in DaVinci Resolve, there's a little section called Camera Raw where you can change the ISO, the picture profile, temperature, tint, exposure, and basically anything that you would normally have to set in camera if you were shooting normal video. You can also completely customize it by setting the black point, white point, contrast, saturation, and even shadow and highlight roll off. This is basically like creating a totally new picture profile for a camera rather than applying a grade on top of a picture profile that already exists. And keep in mind that this all happens, technically speaking, before the color correction and color grading process. This isn't putting a grade on footage, it's actually changing the metadata of the footage. So if you accidentally shot at the totally wrong ISO or white balance, you can change it without putting any strain on the footage. So to sum it up, in case none of that made sense, RAW video is footage with none of the normal stuff like white balance and contrast baked in, giving you a lot of flexibility in post. Cool? Let's move on to log footage. Now, unlike RAW video, log is basically just a picture profile. Well, I say just. Really what log is a very specific picture profile that's used for a very specific purpose, to get the most tonal range possible out of your footage. The log picture profile, whether it be S-Log, C-Log, Log-C, or any other kind of log that you can think of, is all basically made the same way. There's a logarithmic curve, which, by the way, is where the name log comes from, placed on the footage that is designed to bring down the highlights and lift the shadows in order to capture the widest possible dynamic range from the sensor that it can. Now, this will give you more flexibility in post than your standard Rec. 709 footage, but not as much flexibility as RAW, because unlike RAW, which is just sensor data, this is full-blown video, which has the metadata baked in. Now, what this means for editors is that if you're editing log footage that wasn't properly exposed, or if the white balance was off, correcting that is going to put a lot more strain on the footage, because you're going to be making corrections on top of the original information instead of actually changing the original information about the footage like you can do with RAW. So for people who are shooting log, it means that you really need to make sure that you have your white balance and exposure set correctly in camera, so that us editors don't have to strain the footage too much in the correction process. So please, help out your editors. Or yourself, if you do it all. Okay, let's take a look at some log footage. This clip was sent to me by my friend Cody Warner. I'll link his channel down below. You should check it out if you're into filmmaking or looking for ways to make money with video. He's an awesome dude, and I really appreciate him helping me out with this. Now, the first thing that I want to point out to you is how flat this clip looks. There's very little saturation and almost no contrast, and that's because of that logarithmic curve that I was talking about. The highlights are brought down, the shadows are brought up, and if we look at the scopes, you can see that there's very little distance between them. Now, with RAW, we could change all that in a way that puts almost zero strain on the footage, because we can change all of the original metadata using the Camera Raw tool. But when we come over to Camera Raw with the log clip selected, you can see that all of the options are grayed out and unable to be used, so all of those corrections have to be applied in post in order for it to look like something resembling a real video. Now, lucky for me, Cody knows what he's doing behind a camera, because he exposed this and white balanced this almost perfectly. All I have to do is add some contrast, a little bit of saturation, and adjust the temperature slightly in order to get a good color corrected image, and from there I can go on to finish up the grade and make it look the way that I want. But other than that increased dynamic range, log really acts like video from any camera. The only difference is that it has that log gamma curve on there, so you can capture more details in the shadows and the highlights. In fact, I would say that in most cases, log footage has more in common with your regular old Rec. 709 footage than it does with RAW. You have a better chance of retaining detail in the highlights and the shadows than you do with Rec. 709 footage, but because of compression and bit depth, which we'll cover later, you don't have nearly as much flexibility with log footage that you do with RAW. So when it comes to log and RAW video, really the only similarity between the two is the reason why they exist in the first place, to give you the most flexibility in post. But they do that in completely different ways. Log has that gamma curve that gives you a wider tonal range, but other than that, it acts like any other video clip, and RAW just captures all of the sensor data, allowing you to basically change the camera settings after you've already shot the video. Okay, so how does all of that compare to the regular old Rec. 709 footage that you get out of a consumer level DSLR or mirrorless camera? In short, it doesn't. I've got a clip of 8-bit Rec. 709 footage here. Now, this was straight out of the camera. There's no color correction or color grading at all, and as you can see, the contrast, saturation, white balance, and sharpness are all baked into the image. You can't change the metadata like you can with RAW, and you definitely don't have the tonal flexibility that you get with log, and that combined with the compression on the image, again, we'll cover that later, and the bit depth, we'll cover that too, makes this the least optimal type of footage for video editing. In fact, it's even more important that the footage is exposed properly and that the white balance is correct in camera with Rec. 709 footage, because you have a lot less flexibility. Images will pull apart and get weird artifacts a lot easier than if you're working with RAW or log. And the two big reasons for that are, one, the amount of colors you're able to work with, and two, the amount and type of compression on the video file. Let's start with compression. Like I said earlier, this log clip that Cody sent me is 4K 10-bit 422 S-Log3 footage shot in 120 frames per second on the A7S III. Now, I didn't know about this, but this particular video format is only available in H.265 coding, which is notoriously hard to work with. On most computers and most NLEs, video playback on H.265 footage almost always stutters and sometimes completely freezes. Now, I say most computers because in DaVinci Resolve on my computer, that clip played back perfectly, 24 frames per second the whole way through, and it was amazing. And I really have to give Puget Systems props for that, because they designed this PC and they just so happen to be the sponsor of this video. Here's the deal. Not too long ago, I was running my entire business, from my YouTube channel to my freelance work, from a laptop. It was a good laptop, but I was really struggling with playback in DaVinci Resolve, render times, and I was just quickly approaching the point where I could no longer do what I wanted to do with the tool that I was using. So I hopped on a call with Puget Systems, where they took the time to learn more about my workflow, the types of projects I worked on, and even what I was hoping to do in the future, and then they recommended a custom PC build that was designed to handle all of it. And I gotta tell you guys, this thing is awesome. It cuts through footage like butter, launches software super fast, and render times, forget about it. It's incredible. So if you're looking for a more powerful PC that's built for exactly what you do, click the link below and sign up for a free consultation with Puget Systems today. Thanks Puget for sponsoring this video. You guys are the best. Now, what the 2020 is H.265 coding. Basically, H.265 is a method of compressing video. Now, almost every video file, whether it's RAW, log, or Rec 709, has some sort of compression on it. There are basically two different types of compression, intraframe and interframe. Intraframe, which is used in ProRes, DNHR, and RAW, gathers the information that it's compressing from each individual frame. This usually results in a lot more data, which means a larger file with less compression. Interframe compression is a little weird. Instead of reading each individual frame separately, it reads the frames and only collects the differences between them. This results in a much smaller file size, but can also result in lower quality video. If you're confused about how all of that works, I've linked an article from B&H Photo down in the description, which will explain it a lot better than I can without plagiarizing. What's really important to know is how all of these different compression formats interact with your NLE. The basic rule of thumb is this: the more compression there is, the more power you need to decode it, which means the likelier it is that you will have playback issues in your NLE, which means, contrary to popular belief, those smaller file sizes are actually more difficult to work with in post. Basically, RAW, ProRes, and DNHR all have less compression. They're built for the editing process. H.264 and H.265 are delivery formats. They're meant to be shared and streamed and uploaded to the internet. Sure, you technically can edit them, but you're not going to be able to work with it in post as much as you would with those other formats. And H.265 is pretty much the worst when it comes to editing, because the whole purpose of H.265 is to give you more compression while still giving you higher quality, which means it requires the most decoding in order to play it. So why would Sony put something like H.265 compression on a video format like log, which is made to be edited? Simple, because of the higher quality part of the whole more compression, higher quality thing. The amount of data that would be required for 10-bit 422 footage with intraframe compression would be massive and way too much for an SD card or a CF Express Type A card. So the best option is to compress the footage in a way that preserves quality. H.265 is the best option for that right now, so if you're having trouble playing it back in post, you probably want to think about making proxies. Or, you could always call Puget Systems. So throughout this video, I've been saying things like 8-bit 420, 10-bit 422, and 12-bit 444. So what does all that mean? Well, it all means color. Let me explain. When it comes to color and video, there are essentially two things that will tell us what we are looking for. The bit depth, which will tell us how many different shades of red, green, and blue that we're working with, and therefore how many different combinations of red, green, and blue we can have, and Chroma Subsampling, which will tell us how many pixels are actually capturing color data. This can affect artifacting, banding, and all sorts of other unwanted nastiness in your videos. First, let's talk about bit depth. What exactly does 8-bit, 10-bit, and 12-bit mean? To figure this out, we just need to multiply 2 by the power of whatever the bit depth is. So 8-bit is 2 to the power of 8, which is 256. That means 8-bit footage gives us 256 shades of red, 256 shades of blue, and 256 shades of green. If we take 256 and multiply it by a factor of 3, we're looking at over 16 million different color combinations. And for reference, 10-bit video gives us 1,024 shades of each and over 1 billion combinations, and 12-bit gives us 4,096 shades of each and over 68 million color combinations. Now, why is this important? Basically, the more colors you're working with, the easier it is to do things like color grade, qualify skin tones, and work with green screen. When I was working with the SL2 as my main camera, qualifying skin tones was always the biggest obstacle I had to face. Now with the 12-bit footage I get from the Pocket 6K, it's much easier to get a clean qualification. Now, Chroma Subsampling is a different animal entirely. This basically tells us how many of our pixels are collecting color data because, not all of them do. Let's break this down number by number. The first digit, 4, means that each of our pixel rows are 4 pixels long. The second number tells us how many pixels in the top row are collecting color data, and the third number tells us how many pixels on the bottom row are collecting color data. So now let's look at 420 Chroma Subsampling. 420 means that out of the 4 pixels in the top row, 2 of them are collecting color data and none of them are being collected from the bottom row. Now what happens is that the color that's being recorded by those 2 pixels gets stretched, for lack of a better term, across those remaining pixels. This is why you often get banding or artifacting with 8-bit 420 footage. For one, you're not working with as big of a color spectrum and the colors you have are already stretched, so manipulating the image can cause your footage to fall apart. 422, on the other hand, gives you 2 pixels on the top row recording color and 2 pixels on the bottom row collecting color. This still gives you a little bit of stretching, but not nearly as much, and combined with 10-bit color, you have a lot more flexibility in post. And then 444 means that all 4 pixels on both rows are collecting color data, leading to more color in the details, and combined with that 12-bit color, you also have incredible flexibility in post. Okay, so now that I've given you all this information, let's try and simplify it so you can leave here without feeling like your brain is gonna explode like mine does. The best video files for editing are files with a higher bitrate, more pixels recording color, and with as little compression as possible. Also, something with a log curve like that S-Log3 or the Blackmagic film profile will allow for more flexibility. On the other hand, a smaller bit depth with less pixels recording color on a video with more compression and a baked-in picture profile is better for delivery to clients, YouTube, or wherever else you put your videos. All in all, I think that even with the ridiculous compression of H.265, the 10-bit 422 S-Log3 footage is kind of the perfect middle ground between RAW and Rec. 709. It gives you a good amount of flexibility in post, it looks amazing, and as long as you have a good computer, or at least you don't mind making proxies, the H.265 compression is an acceptable compromise. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. All right, one last thing. Since I've started on my whole editing journey, I've come up with a color grading workflow that works pretty well no matter what kind of footage I'm working on. To learn more about that, click here, and for more tools, tips, and tricks that'll make you a better video editor, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.